think everything's in alignment. A bishop in the Church of England stunned his audience into silence with an unexpected and absolutely silly ranting about hell. As he shouted, I say to you, the streets of hell are paved with champagne, fast cars, and loose women. The embarrassed silence was finally broken by a voice quoting Scripture and crying out almost longingly from the back of the congregation, "O death, where is thy sting?" And since the bishop brought it up, I want to talk a little bit about eternity. And this is a rope trick that I learned from Francis Chan, who was the founding pastor of the Cornerstone Church in Simi Valley. So what we need to do this morning is assume that this rope is our eternal existence. So we have to assume then that it just goes on and on and on forever. And this little part here in the red represents our life here on earth. So what we do in the red part is going to influence all of this. And a few months ago, I shared with you the concept of what we do here matters, what we make here matters, how we serve here matters. That concept is dealing with the red part. Our priorities here matter, and it impacts God's kingdom forever. And Jesus so clearly talks about the focus of our service in his first public sermon given in his hometown of Nazareth. And it's recorded for us in Luke chapter 4, starting with verse 14. And it also includes a passage from Isaiah. And it's a rare event because in this case, Jesus actually picks the passage. Normally he's responding one that's been already mentioned in front of him. And in this situation, it's also very rare that he is handed the scroll of Isaiah and he selects the passage that we're going to read in a moment. Now, the practice in the synagogue was for the rabbi to stand and share a few verses from the Hebrew Scripture, then to sit down and explain its meaning. Luke chapter 4, beginning with verse 14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. And this is the part from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." This is the word of the Lord. Now, Isaiah 61 then really becomes a mission statement for anyone who believes in Jesus Christ. This whole sermon is about responsibility and justice and love. And in a much broader sense, it's also about what God is doing in history. Paul tells us in Colossians chapter 1 in verse 20, God is reconciling all things in heaven and earth by making peace through the blood of his Son Jesus on the cross. Everything is being reconciled to God, including us, and it's Jesus who holds the key. So let's talk a little bit about what this means. And to begin with, we need to mention that Jewish scripture is pretty unique in how it describes the creation story. Most ancient cultures, with their creation stories, it generally involves some kind of conflict between warring factions. In Norse mythology, the god Odin defeats the giant Ymir and uses his body parts to create the universe and all of its inhabitants. In a Babylonian creation account, the god Marduk defeats the ocean goddess Tiamat, and he chops her up into pieces and uses all of these pieces to create the heavens and the earth. This is pretty heavy stuff. I mean, this is one major toke over the line. But from the God of Israel, we get the impression that God is like a craftsman or an artisan. It's like a painter painting a picture or a sculpture taking place. In Job chapter 38, God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations and marked out its dimensions?" You see, in the beginning, God created the world for our home, but he also included it as a part of his royal dwelling place as well. And the foundation of God's world would be righteousness and justice and honor and harmony and peace and love. Just like a builder who takes a whole bunch of materials and relates them together to build a house. But there's another image about God creating the world, and that is the idea of a woven garment. In ancient times, woven garments took a long time to make, and therefore they were very valuable. And there's a lot of imagery in the Old Testament dealing with garments and clothing and fabric. Some examples in Psalm 104, where it talks about the lights of the sky. "O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. He wraps himself in light as with a garment." And then later on in that chapter, talks about the ocean. "You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment." And in Job, it talks about the clouds. And this is where God is answering Job out of a storm. "Who shut the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness." So we get this idea that the world is like a fabric. And if you look at it this way, if we take individual fabrics like this, threads, and we throw them up in the air, and I wave my hand over them, and I do the hokey pokey, and I turn myself around, we're not going to get a fabric. The threads have to relate to each other in millions of different ways, each thread going over and around and through at thousands of different points. Then we get a fabric that is strong and it covers and it's beautiful. And this concept of the metaphor of the fabric really brings up the idea of relationship, how things relate to each other and how important it is. And God created the world to live in harmony, to be an interdependent, woven relationship, one with another. And from this, we get the idea of community. And the Bible calls this interwovenness shalom, or harmonious peace. And as Presbyterians, I think when we think of shalom, the first thing that comes to mind is the word peace. But it could even be more. It's like a complete reconciliation, emotionally, physically, spiritually, socially. The analogy that we could use, a young person, they have strength, and they have beauty, and they have energy. But an injury can cause that all to fall out of alignment. Or cancer cells start to work against the other systems in the body. And as a result, then, our physical shalom starts to break down. And our body systems are no longer working in harmony. Or if we're experiencing mental well-being, where our emotional needs are in sync with our conscience and our reason says, this is good. But we want something so desperately. We want it so bad. And even when our reason says this is futile, and our conscience keeps tapping us on the shoulder and saying, look at Pilgrim, you got your spurs all tangled up here. But we want it so bad that our inner psychological shalom begins to break down. And we get words like anxiety and guilt enter into the conversation. And we keep waiting for our Xanax to kick in. But if you think about it, the world in which we live is really not characterized by shalom. In Genesis, in the beginning, we walked with God in the garden, and we served Him. But we became estranged from God. We became estranged from each other. We became selfish and self-absorbed. And we moved away from God. And shalom then was broken, was frayed. So now we go back to the passage that we've been looking at this morning in Isaiah and in Luke, where we defined our mission statement, where we defined our sense of responsibility, where we really defined our role in the community, or where we defined our role in the red part. And what that means is we go places where the fabric of shalom has broken down, and elements in our society are falling through the fabric. And what that means is we strengthen the fabric, we re-weave it. That's hard to say. We re-weave it by weaving ourselves into it. In other words, we thread our talents, our gifts, our resources into the needs and lives of others. A real-life example of a community seeking shalom is described in a book by Nora Ellen Gross. She published it in 1984, so it was a long time ago. And it's entitled, Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language. Now, in the 1980s, Professor Gross was researching hereditary deafness on Martha's Vineyard, something which I'm sure all of us have done at one time or another. And the earliest settlers there, all the European settlers in the 17th century, all came from one place in England, around Kent, England, in a place called Weald, where there was a high incidence of hereditary deafness. And on the vineyard then, because of the geographical isolation and the fact of intermarriage, the incidence of hereditary deafness increased dramatically over the whole island. So that by the beginning of the 19th century, in America as a whole, when one in about every 5,700 Americans was born with some kind of hearing deficiency, on the vineyard it was one in every 155. So don't cancel your honeymoon plans if you purchase vineyards. Because of the growth of population and the marriage with off-islanders, hereditary deafness has vanished from the vineyard. In fact, the last person born deaf on the vineyard died in 1952. But Professor Gross was intrigued by the attitude of the hearing population on the island towards the high percentage of non-hearing people. And in the 1980s, she interviewed an elderly resident who said, as a kid, I spoke sign language. My mother spoke sign language. My grandparents spoke sign language. And we viewed the deaf people in our community not as handicapped. They were just deaf. It didn't make any difference. Now the point for us, I suppose, in most modern societies, the physically challenged normally have to adapt to the life patterns of the non-challenged. But that didn't happen on the vineyard. In that time, the entire community, quote, disadvantaged themselves for the sake of the minority. And as a result, then, The hearing became bilingual, and the non-hearing gained full social participation. A culture was changed. A culture became inclusive. The people on the vineyard wove themselves into the fabric of the community. Now, I admit that Martha's Vineyard is a very focused and unique historical example, but I think it has legs. The principle has legs, because we as Christians, at times we need to step up and take care of, address the needs of the marginalized, the dispossessed, the poor. If not, our very fabric of community is going to fray, and we're going to fall through it. If you look at the life of Jesus, the very reason why we're here today, Jesus, born in a stable, spent his entire life with the poor and the dispossessed. At the end of his life, he enters Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey, spends his last night in a borrowed room, and is buried in a borrowed tomb. They cast lots for the only possession that he had. He died naked and penniless, discarded, thrown away. But it's only because of Jesus Christ that you and I have any hope. Jesus, a life poured out in helping the needy, the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized, the deaf. To quote the scripture again, he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. The fabric, then, represents us, Canyon Hills. You cannot deny the sense of energy and focus that our church has experienced over the last several months. We have woven ourselves into a relationship. We more than ever see ourselves as God's church that has the mission to reach out to others. Now, we have yet to talk about the quilt. The quilt, for one thing, of course, is an extension of the fabric in a much broader scale. But also, it represents what we do here matters. What we make here matters. How we serve here matters. It represents what Jesus was saying in Isaiah. It's that mission statement. It represents the missions that we have here. It represents the red part. Now, we're going to close here in a minute. And I love Snow. I love what you did today. It was perfect. I wish you'd do it again, because it will really relate right now. I would like for all of you in this room, and just one at a time, obviously, but for people to share, just to say it very loud, the different missions that we have locally and also in the world. If someone would just start, I'll start, because that's what's represented here by this quilt. Our mission in Mexico. Someone else. Sorry? Mercy. Okay.
Casa Teresa.
Got it.
Sheepfold.
Very good.
Mary's Kitchen.
Paint your heart out.
Paint your heart out.
Giving children hope.
Right? Say it loud.
Illuminations.
Illumination.
Blood drive.
Blood drive.
Caterina's Club.
Caterina's Club.
Giving children hope.
Giving children hope.
Trunk or treat.
Very good. You see, what we have done is that we have woven ourselves into the local community. We have woven ourselves into the world community at various places on this globe. The quilt then represents our efforts at harmonious peace. It represents our efforts to achieve complete reconciliation. It represents our efforts to achieve shalom. Canyon Hills, shalom.